Jake Thornton had always been a man of the land. The cowboy lifestyle was all he had ever known. From the moment he could walk, he was taught the ways of the wilderness, how to ride horses, herd cattle, and survive the harsh conditions of the wild frontier. He was strong, independent, and unafraid of the dangers that came with living on the open range. The vast Arizona landscape stretched out before him, filled with the promise of freedom, but also the threat of constant struggle. It was during one of his long cattle drives that Jake's life would change in a way he could never have imagined. The sun was high in the sky, casting its scorching rays over the dry, barren land. The cattle were restless, and Jake was focused on keeping the herd moving in the right direction. He had been on this cattle drive for days with no sign of slowing down. The only company he had were the other cowboys, a few good men who shared his love for the open range. But despite the camaraderie, the solitude of the land weighed heavily on him. Days stretched into weeks, and life on the trail had a way of making everything seem distant, even the people he loved. One afternoon, as the cowboys were driving the herd along a dusty trail, something caught Jake's attention. There in the distance, he saw a small figure standing alone. At first, he thought it was a mirage, the heat of the desert playing tricks on his eyes. But as he got closer, the figure became clearer. A young girl no older than 10 or 12 standing on the edge of a small canyon. Jake's heart skipped a beat. A child alone in such a dangerous place? It didn't make sense. He spurred his horse forward, riding closer to the girl. As he approached, he saw that she was wearing a tattered dress, her feet bare against the rough terrain. Her hair was wild and unkempt, and her face was streaked with dirt. But what struck Jake the most were her eyes. Dark, deep eyes that held a look of both fear and determination. "Hey there, little one," Jake called out gently, pulling his horse to a stop. The girl didn't say a word, but her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that surprised him. She was thin, and it was clear from the way she stood that she had been through something difficult. Jake had seen many things in his time as a cowboy: tough men, wild animals, and unforgiving weather, but never had he come across a child in such a state. "Where are your parents?" Jake asked, his voice softer now. The girl remained silent, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't answer, but her gaze seemed to say everything. It was as if she was asking him to understand that words weren't enough. She had lost something, or perhaps someone, and now she was here, standing alone on the edge of the world. Jake dismounted from his horse and approached the girl slowly, not wanting to startle her. As he got closer, he saw that she was holding something tightly in her hands, something small wrapped in cloth. It was hard to tell what it was, but it seemed to be her only possession, her only connection to the world she had come from. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his heart aching for the child. The girl finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm a hoolie," she said, her words soft but firm. "I'm alone now. My people, they are gone." Jake's heart sank as the reality of the situation began to settle in. A hoolie was an Apache girl. Her people had been in the area for centuries, living off the land and following their traditions. Jake had heard stories about the Apache, their strength, their way of life, and their struggles with the settlers who had been pushing into their lands. It was a time of conflict, and the land was becoming more dangerous with each passing year. "I'm sorry, Ahuli," Jake said, feeling a deep sadness for her. "What happened to your people?" Ahuli looked down at the ground, her shoulders shaking slightly as if the weight of her memories was too much to bear. She didn't answer right away, and Jake gave her the space she needed. He could see that she was trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the loss she had suffered. After a long pause, she finally spoke again, her voice steady but filled with pain. "They took my family," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "The soldiers came and they took them away. I ran. I had to run." Jake could hear the pain in her voice, and it broke his heart. He had heard stories of the violence that had torn apart the lives of the native people, but hearing it from someone so young made it feel real, made it feel personal. Ahuli was just a child, and yet she had already experienced more loss and hardship than most people would in a lifetime. "Where do you live, Ahuli?" Jake asked, his voice soft but urgent. "Do you have a home?" Ahuli shook her head, her long hair swaying with the movement. "I don't have a home anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere to go." Jake stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The world around them was vast and unforgiving, He couldn't just leave this child alone in the wilderness. She was too young, too vulnerable. But what could he do? He wasn't sure if he could bring her back to his ranch, and he wasn't sure what kind of future awaited her there. He had no family of his own to offer her, and life on the frontier was harsh for anyone, let alone a child. But something in Jake's heart stirred, something deep and instinctive. He had made a promise to protect her, even if it was only a promise in his own heart. He couldn't turn his back on her. He couldn't leave her to face the world alone. "You're not alone, Ahuli," Jake said, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll help you. I'll take care of you. You won't have to face this alone." Ahuli looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She had heard promises before, but this one felt different. There was something in Jake's eyes, something genuine. He wasn't just saying the words to make her feel better. He meant it. For the first time in a long time, Ahuli felt a flicker of hope. "I promise you this," Jake continued. "One day, when you're older, when you're ready, I'll come back for you. I'll take you away from all this. I'll make sure you have a future. We'll be together." Ahuli didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, a small gesture that spoke volumes. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, in this moment, she believed him. Jake helped her onto his horse, and together, they rode away from the place where her world had fallen apart. As the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow over the horizon, Jake couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold for both of them. He had made a promise that would shape both their lives in ways he couldn't yet understand. But one thing was certain. He would never forget the little Apache girl who had stolen his heart, and he would do everything in his power to keep his word. The years passed quickly, as they often do in the wild and rugged world of the American frontier. Jake Thornton's life continued much the same, working the ranch, driving cattle, and dealing with the countless challenges of the wilderness. Though the years brought their share of changes, one thing remained constant: his promise to Ahuli. The memory of that small Apache girl, who had trusted him with her safety and her future, never left his mind. Jake often found himself thinking about the promise he had made to Ahuli that day in the desert, so many months ago. He had said that he would return for her one day, that he would make sure she had a better life. But as time went on, life on the ranch became more demanding. The cattle needed attention, the land had to be managed, and there were always challenges to face, both from nature and from people. Jake wasn't a man who easily allowed himself to be distracted, but the image of that little girl, her dark eyes filled with hope and vulnerability, haunted him. He couldn't just forget her. As the years passed, Jake's responsibilities on the ranch grew. He had built up a successful business, and with success came more work, more land, more cattle, more people to manage. Jake had made a name for himself in the area as a reliable rancher, someone who could be trusted to do what he said he would do. But in his heart, a part of him felt like he was living in two worlds. The life he had built for himself was solid, but it felt like something was missing, a promise he had made that had yet to be fulfilled. For Ahuli, life had taken a different turn. After Jake left her in the desert, she had spent a long time wandering alone. She had been just a child when they first met, but now she was a young woman. The harsh realities of life had shaped her, and she quickly learned how to survive on her own. The wilderness was a place of danger, but it was also a place of strength. Ahuli had become strong in both body and spirit. She no longer saw herself as a helpless girl in need of protection, but as a warrior with the skills to face whatever came her way. Ahuli had joined a group of Apache warriors, learning their ways and customs. She learned how to fight, how to survive in the wilderness, and how to lead. The life she once knew, the life that had been filled with love and warmth, was now a distant memory. In its place was a fierce determination to protect her people and avenge the loss she had suffered. Though she had never forgotten Jake's promise, she understood that the world had changed, and she had to change with it. The people she had once known were gone, and now she had become part of a larger struggle, one that would determine the fate of her people and their way of life. Over time, Ahuli's strength and leadership skills caught the attention of her people. She became a respected warrior, known for her bravery and her unshakable resolve. But even as she earned the respect of those around her, she never forgot Jake. The memory of the cowboy who had promised her a future, who had given her hope when there seemed to be none, stayed with her. In her heart, she clung to the idea that one day, Jake would come back for her, just as he had said. But as the years went by, Ahuli began to question whether that promise was just a fleeting moment in time, a promise made out of kindness but never meant to be kept. The world had changed, and so had she. She had become a warrior, someone who was capable of fighting for herself and her people. She had learned not to rely on the promises of others, but to rely on her own strength. Despite the pain of losing her family and her way of life, Ahuli had come to realize that the world would not offer her mercy. It was a harsh world full of conflict and strife, and if she wanted to survive, she would have to fight. She would have to become more than just the girl who had once met a cowboy in the desert. She would have to become a force to be reckoned with, a leader, a protector, and a warrior. As time passed, Jake continued to work the ranch. He had no family of his own, but he had built up a small, loyal group of cowboys who helped him manage the land. His reputation as a hard-working and honest man had earned him the respect of many in the area. Still, there was something missing. Every time he rode out to check the cattle or spent long hours in the barn, his thoughts would drift back to Ahuli. He had made that promise to her, and yet he hadn't returned to fulfill it. Every time he thought about her, a deep sense of guilt would settle in his chest. He had promised her a future, a life together, but he had never gone back to make that promise a reality. The years had changed him as well. He wasn't the young cowboy who had first met Ahuli in the desert. He had become a man who had seen the reality of life on the frontier. He had seen men die in gunfights, cattle stolen in the night, and people driven from their land. He had seen the destruction of nature and the toll that progress was taking on the land. The world was changing, and Jake knew that he couldn't stay in his bubble forever. He had to face the truth of what was happening around him. One cold morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Jake stood outside his ranch house, gazing out at the land he had worked so hard to build. The cattle grazed lazily in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of the desert. Jake's mind, however, was far away, back to that moment when he had promised Ahuli that he would return. He had not fulfilled his promise, and now, as he stood there, the weight of that failure pressed down on him. Jake knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The promise he had made to Ahuli had become a heavy burden, one that had been dragging him down for years. He couldn't just let it go. He couldn't let her down again. So Jake made a decision. He would leave the ranch. He would go back to the desert, to the place where he had first met Ahuli. He would find her, and he would make good on his promise. Jake packed his things and rode out into the desert, the wind kicking up dust behind him. As he rode, memories of Ahuli flooded his mind. The little girl who had trusted him. The promise he had made. He had no idea what he would find when he got there, or if Ahuli would even remember him. But he knew that he couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try to fulfill his word. As Jake rode across the vast, empty desert, he couldn't help but wonder, had Ahuli become the warrior he had always feared she would? Or was she still the girl he had met all those years ago, waiting for him to come back? Either way, Jake knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let the past slip away. He had to face it no matter what. Jake had been riding for days, the harsh desert sun beating down on him, and the endless stretch of land rolling out before him, much the same as it had when he first made his promise to Ahuli. The journey was long and filled with uncertainty. He had no clear idea of where he was going or whether Ahuli was even still alive. Yet he couldn't bring himself to turn back. Every mile he covered was a reminder of the promise he had made all those years ago, a promise that now seemed more important than ever. His mind wandered back to that moment when he had first met Ahuli. She had been so small, so fragile. He could still see the look in her eyes, the way she had trusted him when he offered her the promise of safety and a future. He hadn't been sure of how he could fulfill that promise at the time, but he had known one thing for sure. He couldn't let her face the world alone. And now, as he rode across the desert, the weight of that promise pressed heavily on him. Jake had tried to push away the guilt that had followed him all these years, But the closer he got to the place where he had last seen Ahuli, the stronger that feeling became. What if she was gone? What if he had failed her and she had moved on with her life? What if, in the years that had passed, she had become something else entirely, a person who didn't need him anymore? These thoughts clouded his mind as he rode, but he couldn't let them stop him. He had come this far, and he was determined to find her. He had been on this journey for nearly a week when, one evening as the sun dipped low on the horizon, he reached the familiar desert landscape where he and Ahuli had once met. The same wide open spaces stretched before him, the same rugged canyons and sparse vegetation. It was strange. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. The land was still harsh, unforgiving, but Jake had changed. He wasn't the same man who had wandered through this desert years ago. He had lived a life full of hard work, lessons learned, and promises made. But he still wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. That night, Jake camped alone, his thoughts drifting between the past and the present. What had become of Ahuli? What kind of woman had she turned into? Had she found a new purpose, or was she still haunted by the ghosts of her past? His mind raced with questions, and the quiet desert night seemed to offer no answers. The next morning, Jake continued his journey, and after several more days of riding, he began to notice signs of life in the distance. He hadn't expected to find any signs of civilization this far out in the desert, but there they were, footprints in the sand, the faint trail of hoof prints, and signs of movement. His heart quickened as he followed the tracks, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it Ahuli, or had someone else come this way? He continued to follow the trail, and as the sun began to set, he saw a figure in the distance. At first he couldn't be sure, but as he drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was a person. No, a woman, riding a horse, moving with a confidence and grace that immediately struck Jake. She wasn't just riding. She was riding with purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going. The way she sat on the horse, the way she held herself, everything about her seemed to say that this wasn't just any ordinary person. As the woman turned and rode closer, Jake's heart skipped a beat. There in front of him was Ahuli, but she was no longer the small, frightened girl he had once known. She had grown into a woman, tall, strong, and undeniably fierce. Her face was weathered from years in the wild, her eyes sharp and full of life. Her hair, once unkempt and tangled, was now tied back, and her clothes were that of a warrior, practical and worn from years of survival in the harsh desert. Ahuli didn't recognize Jake at first. She stopped her horse just a few paces away from him, her gaze steady and unreadable. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Jake's heart pounded as he realized how much she had changed. The girl who had once looked to him for protection was now a woman who was fully capable of taking care of herself. "Who are you?" Ahuli asked, her voice calm but firm, showing no hint of recognition. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was the moment he had been dreading and anticipating for so long. He had no idea how she would react, but he knew one thing. He couldn't hide from the truth. "It's me, Jake," he said, his voice a little rough. "Jake Thornton. You probably don't remember me. We met years ago in the desert." Ahuli's expression remained unreadable for a long moment, as if she was trying to process his words. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing slightly before she spoke again, her tone colder this time. "Jake Thornton?" she repeated slowly. "The cowboy who promised me, what was it, marriage? A future?" Jake felt a lump form in his throat at her words. Her voice had a bite to it, a bitterness that stung. He had known that it would be difficult to explain himself, but hearing those words come from Ahuli made him realize just how much time had passed, and just how much they had both changed. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't know what the world would bring back then. I didn't know how to keep that promise, but I never forgot it. I promised I'd come back for you, and I've come to try and make good on that promise." Ahuli didn't speak immediately. Instead, she simply looked at him, her eyes betraying nothing of what she was thinking. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. The wind blew softly, stirring the dust around them as the desert stretched out endlessly in every direction. "You came back?" Ahuli finally asked, her voice now softer, almost incredulous. "You really came back after all these years?" Jake nodded slowly. "I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know if you were still here, or if you would even remember me. But I had to come back. I couldn't just let it go." Ahuli seemed to consider his words for a long time, her expression unreadable. Jake held his breath, unsure of what she would say next. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of all the years that had passed. Finally, Ahuli spoke again, her voice quieter now, tinged with something Jake couldn't quite place. "I remember," she said softly. "I remember you. I remember your promise, and I remember the way I felt when you said you would come back. But things have changed. I have changed." Jake's heart sank as he realized the weight of her words. She wasn't the girl he had left behind. She wasn't waiting for him. She had become someone else, someone strong, someone who had built her own future. "I know," Jake said, his voice thick with regret. "I can't change what's happened. I can't undo the years. But I wanted to see you again. I wanted to make sure that promise wasn't forgotten." Ahuli didn't respond right away. She simply watched him for a long moment, her gaze intense and searching, as if she was looking for something that might no longer be there. Finally she nodded, her face softening just slightly. "You came back," she said quietly, "and for that I'll remember you. But things are different now, Jake. I'm not the girl you left behind." Jake nodded in understanding, realizing that the future he had once imagined wasn't waiting for him. The promise had been a spark of hope in a world that had since moved on. The only question now was what they would do next. Jake stood there, his heart heavy as Ahuli's words sank in. She wasn't the young, frightened girl he had promised to protect. The promise he had made so long ago seemed distant now, like a memory that was slowly slipping away. He had come back expecting to find the same child he had once known, the same innocent girl who had trusted him. But instead, standing before him was a strong and independent woman, a warrior. The years had shaped her into someone who no longer needed protection, who no longer needed his promise. The silence between them stretched out, thick with unspoken words. Jake didn't know what to say. He had come all this way, riding across the desert to find Ahuli again, to fulfill the promise he had made. But now that he was here standing in front of her, it felt like he had stepped into a world he didn't fully understand. He had known the young Ahuli, but this woman, this warrior, was someone completely different. "I'm not that girl anymore, Jake," Ahuli said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't need saving, and I don't need someone to come and rescue me. I've made my own way in this world." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on him. He had always seen himself as a protector, someone who could make things right, someone who could offer safety. But the world had changed, and Ahuli had changed with it. She didn't need someone to take care of her anymore. She had learned to take care of herself, to survive on her own terms. "I can see that," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to make you feel like you weren't strong enough. I just wanted to keep my word. I promised you, and I couldn't forget that." Ahuli's gaze softened for a moment, and she looked down at the ground. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler, though still firm. "You kept your word by coming back," she said. "But what do we do now? The past is gone, Jake. We can't go back to the way things were." Jake's heart sank as he realized the truth of her words. The past was gone, and no amount of time or effort could bring it back. The world had moved on, and so had they. He had ridden across the desert to find the girl he had promised to protect, but the girl he had known was no longer here. Ahuli had become someone else, someone who no longer needed the promise of a future. She had forged her own path, and that path didn't include him. "I never expected things to stay the same," Jake said, his voice quiet. "I knew you would change, I guess I thought maybe we could find a way to move forward together." Ahuli looked at him, her expression unreadable. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice low and steady. "I can't promise you that, Jake. My people are in danger. I've chosen to fight for them, to protect what's left of our way of life. And that means I can't afford to look back. I can't afford to dwell on promises that were made in another time." Jake felt a pang of sadness deep in his chest. He had known that things had changed, but hearing Ahuli say it so plainly made it all feel final. She was no longer the girl he had once known. She had become a leader, a warrior who was focused on a different future, one that didn't include him. "I understand," Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hold you back. I just thought that maybe we could find something in all of this, something we both wanted." Ahuli's eyes softened, and for a moment Jake saw the faintest trace of the girl he had met so many years ago. But that girl was gone now, replaced by the woman standing before him. And though Jake's heart ached with the loss, He knew that he couldn't change what had already happened. They had both changed and they had both moved on. I think we both wanted different things, Ahuli said softly, and that's okay. Sometimes things don't turn out the way we hope, but we can still move forward. We can still choose our own paths. Jake nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He had come all this way, chasing a memory, hoping to find something that was no longer there, but maybe, in a way, it was time to let go of that memory. He couldn't live in the past forever. He couldn't hold on to a promise that had been made in a different time, under different circumstances. Ahuli had her own path to follow now, and he had his. As the silence stretched between them again, Jake felt the sting of the moment, but he also felt a sense of peace settling over him. He had made his journey, and he had found Ahuli. He had kept his promise to her, even if it wasn't in the way he had imagined. The world had changed, and so had they, but that didn't mean they couldn't find a way to move forward. "I'm proud of you, Ahuli," Jake said, his voice steady now. "You've become someone I never could have imagined. You've done what I never could have done, and that's something to be proud of." Ahuli's eyes met his, and for the first time since their reunion she smiled. Just a small smile, but one that held a wealth of understanding. She had always respected Jake, even as a child, but now as an adult, she could see that he had come to understand her in a way that few people could. He had come back, not out of obligation, but out of a deep sense of honor and respect for the promise he had made. "Thank you, Jake," she said softly, "for everything." There was a long pause as they both stood there, the wind blowing gently through the desert. It was strange how much had changed in such a short time, but as Jake looked at Ahuli, he realized that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that reason had already been fulfilled. He had kept his promise, and now it was time for both of them to move on. "I guess this is goodbye then," Jake said quietly. Ahuli nodded. "For now," she replied. "But the world is big, Jake. Maybe our paths will cross again someday." Jake smiled, a bittersweet smile, as he turned to leave. He knew that this was the end of one chapter of his life, but the beginning of another. Ahuli was no longer the girl he had promised to protect. She was her own person now, a warrior, a leader, and though their futures might not be the same, they had both found their own way. As Jake rode away, the weight of the years lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know where the road would take him next, but he knew one thing for sure. He had kept his word, and sometimes that was all a man could do. Jake had left behind the dust of the desert, but as he rode back toward his ranch, the weight of his journey still lingered. He had come all the way to find Ahuli, to fulfill a promise that had been made so many years ago. But now that it was over, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had changed, not just in Ahuli, but in him too. The time had passed, and they had both grown in ways that neither had expected. But he couldn't help but wonder if there was still something left to be done. The land stretched out before him as he rode, the rolling hills and the wide-open sky offering a kind of solace. There was a peaceful quiet to the wilderness, one that matched his mood. Yet beneath that calm, a small part of him felt unsettled. He had come so far, and now that his journey was complete, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was as though the promise he had made so long ago was the last link to a past that was slipping further away. Back at his ranch, life went on as usual. The cattle needed tending to, and the men who worked with him expected his guidance just as they always had. But something had changed inside him. He couldn't shake the memory of Ahuli, the warrior she had become, and the way she had looked at him when they parted. Her words echoed in his mind. "The past is gone, Jake. We can't go back to the way things were." Those words had hit him harder than anything else. He had expected her to need him, to welcome him back into her life, but she had moved forward, and in doing so, had shown him that he needed to do the same. Days passed, and Jake threw himself into his work. The cattle needed attention, the fences had to be repaired, and there were always matters to attend to. But when the sun dipped below the horizon each night and the world grew quiet, his thoughts inevitably drifted back to Ahuli. He thought about how strong she had become, how independent she was. She had a cause now, something bigger than herself, something she was willing to fight for. It made him realize that his own life, though comfortable, didn't have that same sense of purpose. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch of his ranch house, sipping his coffee and looking out at the land, A thought began to take shape in his mind. He had always been a man of action, a man who worked hard and got things done. He had promised Ahuli he would come back, and he had. But he realized now that just fulfilling that promise wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply return to the place where they had met, or to make peace with the past. He had to find something more, something that would give his life the kind of meaning he had seen in Ahuli's eyes. It wasn't long before Jake made up his mind. He couldn't keep living as he had been, stuck in the routine of the ranch, working day in and day out without thinking about what came next. He needed to find his own purpose, just as Ahuli had found hers. She was fighting for her people, fighting for their survival in a world that didn't understand them. And he realized that he too had to stand for something that would allow him to move forward, to become more than just a rancher. Jake spent the next few weeks preparing. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had learned from Ahuli that nothing worth doing ever was. He would need to leave the ranch for a time, to step away from everything he had built in order to find his new path. His decision wasn't just about the promise to Ahuli anymore. It was about his own future, about finding a way to live with purpose and integrity. He couldn't just be a man who worked the land and followed the same patterns every day. There was more to life than that, and he was determined to find it. One morning, just as the first light of day began to break over the horizon, Jake saddled up his horse and set out once again. This time he wasn't riding back into the desert to search for Ahuli. He was riding to find something else, to find the next chapter in his life, the one that would give him the kind of meaning he had seen in the eyes of the Apache warrior. His journey was no longer about fulfilling a promise to another person. It was about fulfilling a promise to himself, to be the kind of man who could stand tall in the face of challenges and do something that mattered. Jake didn't know what the future held, but he knew that it was waiting for him. The road ahead wasn't clear, but that was part of the challenge. It wasn't about knowing what would come next. It was about the willingness to step into the unknown and find out. As he rode, the wind tugged at his shirt and the sun rose higher in the sky. He had no idea where this journey would take him, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was. He had to keep moving forward, just as Ahuli had. As he passed through small towns and across vast stretches of open land, Jake encountered people, farmers, ranchers, travelers. Some of them greeted him with curiosity, others with skepticism. They all had their own stories, their own struggles, and each of them seemed to carry something that weighed heavily on them. But no matter where Jake went, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was searching for something bigger than himself. He hadn't fully figured out what it was, but he was starting to feel a pull, a call to do something more with his life than what he had been doing before. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, Jake found himself in a small town near the Apache lands. It was a place where people came to trade and rest, a crossroads of sorts. He had heard whispers about a group of Apache who were fighting to protect their land, to preserve their way of life. They were led by a woman, a warrior who was known for her courage and leadership. As Jake walked through the dusty streets of the town, he couldn't help but wonder if this was where his journey was meant to lead him. He spent some time in the town, learning more about the struggles the Apache people were facing. The settlers were pushing further into their land, and the government had taken steps to force them onto reservations. Jake had seen enough of the world to understand the injustices that were happening, but it wasn't until he heard the stories of the Apache people that he realized how deep the hurt ran. These were people who had lived on this land for generations, and now they were being pushed aside, their future uncertain. Jake thought about Ahuli, about the promise he had made to her. He thought about how strong and determined she had become, and he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to make a difference. He wasn't a warrior like Ahuli, but he was a man who knew how to fight in his own way. He knew how to stand up for what was right, and he knew that this fight was one worth joining. In the days that followed, Jake found a new purpose. He worked alongside the Apache, helping them with their cause, learning their ways, and standing with them as they fought for their land. It wasn't easy and it wasn't always safe, but Jake felt something in his heart that he hadn't felt before. A sense of belonging, a sense that this was the right thing to do. He had come so far to find Ahuli, and though their paths had diverged, he had found something even more important than a promise fulfilled. He had found a cause worth fighting for, a purpose that gave his life meaning beyond the land he worked. And as he stood side by side with the Apache people, Jake knew that he had finally found the path he had been searching for all along.